contributed a number of reports, most recently on urban metabolism, which he may be or may not be going to talk to us about. He struck me then as a very significant thinker, person, and then when I heard he was doing a sabbatical at LSE, or coming over here for some quiet writing time, I of course thought I would grab him, and he's come to give us a seminar, which is terrific. He has a very eminent CV, as you would expect. I'm not going to give you all of it by any means, because I'm sure you'd much rather hear his lecture. You can find it, University of Stellenbosch Sustainability Institute. He got his PhD here in England at the University of Warwick, Department of Sociology. He's had positions, professorships at the University of Witwatersrand, but at some point over the last few years he's decided to devote himself to sustainable development, set up the Sustainability Institute where he's academic director, and the director is his wife, Eve Anneke, so I'm looking forward to meeting her later this evening. And through that platform he has become a very significant figure in the global sustainable development movement. Most recently, I know, very much involved with the United Nations efforts to establish sustainable development goals following the 2015 period after the Millennium Development Goals. So without further ado, Mark, it's an enormous pleasure and privilege, and we're very much looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul, and good evening, everybody. My primary intellectual project, given where I'm based, the southern tip of the African continent, is to change the discourse around the nature of African development. And this is getting somewhat easier to do. It's becoming a much more exciting intellectual environment, not least because of this shift in the popular image of Africa as the hopeless continent to Africa rising. But what that means is highly contested. In the academic literature, we have the advantage of the fact that what a well-known academic called Mkhandawire calls the impossibility thesis is on the decline. The idea that what happened in Asia would never happen in Africa. What happened with development in Latin America will never happen in Africa. That's on the decline. The rise of the developmental state, the idea of the developmental state, of the discourse of resource nationalism, of the decline of the conventional great powers and the rise of the significance of the BRICS countries, all opens up opportunities for a discussion about where this continent is going. Now, what I'm particularly interested in, as you can gather from Paul's comments, is this question of resources. So although I'm rooted in the sustainability science environment, I'm actually less interested in carbon and much more interested in resources and resource flows. I'm much less interested in environmental impacts and much more interested in the environment, in the natural resource inputs into the global economy. And that is not just of intellectual significance, it's of strategic significance, because the commodity boom that we've just gone through, which has seen a reversal of 100 years of decline in resource prices, is a fundamental driver of this scenario. And questions are now being asked. How sustainable is it for Africa's growth rates to continue to be this high on the back of basically resource extraction? So I want to explore an understanding of global transition, because what I'm trying to do is engage in the African discussion by saying that Africa really has, or African countries and economies and African intellectuals and movements have a choice to make. The one option is to anticipate what's going to happen to the world over the next 20 or 30 years and say, this time round, we Africans are not going to miss the boat, because basically we missed the post-Second World War long-term development cycle. The second option is to say, well, we're not going to take a reading on that. We're going to wait and see. And when we can see which direction it's starting to move, we will place our bets. Now, my argument is going to be distinctly and decisively in the first option, that Africa needs to take a reckoning on the future in order to shape the way it understands the choices it has to make in the present. And many of those choices are about infrastructures. Africa is to some extent quite unique. It hasn't sunk in concrete the technologies of an energy and resource intensive past, which now have to be dismantled. Africa still has to make many of these investments. So the question is, who's going to spec those investments? What kind of futures are informing the designers of these infrastructures, in particular cities? And what are the underlying assumptions about the dynamics of the crisis we're in and the possible trajectories beyond the current crisis? So that's really what I would like to address. But I want to do that by qualifying the notion of Africa immediately. This is a wonderful map of the continent of Africa, which shows how all the other continents fit into it, which is basically to make nonsense of the notion of Africa as a single place with a single trajectory. This is China, this is India, this is the United States, this is Europe, this is the UK. This is a big place, very, very diverse. Nevertheless, just for the sake of this conversation and the limits of it, let's stick with this notion. So if you want to explore these ideas a little bit further, Eve and I published this book last year, Just Transitions, and I updated the conceptualization of transition that I was wrestling with there in this article that was published this year in the journal Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions. So I just invite you to explore these ideas a little bit further by looking at this material. The other reference point for this discussion is what Paul has already referred to, which is the work of the International Resource Panel set up in 2007 in the wake of the fourth assessment report of the IPCC, in order to address the question that the IPCC didn't really address, which was how to transform the global economy to make it more sustainable. And UNEP decided, well, let's set up a dedicated panel to discuss that issue, because after all, economists haven't quite figured out how to spell sustainability. And one of the central operating concepts of this group of very diverse people from very diverse disciplinary backgrounds is this idea of decoupling. The possibility of decoupling, in particular, resource use from economic growth or economic development, and I was one of the co-lead authors of this. I'm very aware of the controversies around this concept and Tim Jackson's rejection of the idea. But I think it is worth playing with, especially in a developing country context where we still have to face types of growth, the question of the types of growth. I'm not going to dwell on any of the evidence about unsustainability. I'm just going to take that as read and rather play with the ideas. But just to mark out the territory, if you like, in the worst possible and most reductionist way, in a set of numbers. The transition from an unsustainable to a more sustainable world has got something to do with reduced amount of carbon per capita. And for the resource panel, the average, this is what the decoupling report talks about. Our average consumption is about 8 tons per capita at the moment at a population of 7 billion people. If we go up to 9.5, 10 billion, and we assume the end of poverty in developing countries by 2050, we would end up if we all consumed like Europeans at 16 tons per capita and extracting 140 billion tons of resources, and we're not extracting, using 140 billion tons, and we're currently at 60. So we have to face this challenge. And if you want to run the world from a material point of view, according to the science of IPCC, you're looking at 6 tons per capita, which for the average European is a drop from 16 to 6, the average American from 25 to 6. And for us in developing countries, completely redefining what development means. So I'm taking all of that as read, and I want to deal with a couple of concepts in thinking about transition. And for me, there are 3 bodies of literature that I have spent the last couple of years trying to synthesize. One is the reworking of the history of the industrial era using a metabolic perspective, the work of Marina Fisher-Kowalski. The work of Carlota Perez, the Venezuelan economist of technological revolutions. And the third is Charles Gore, who until recently was an economist at UNCTAD, this very important article in the Journal of International Development on the global recession and the implications for how we think about the next long-term development cycle. So what I want to suggest is that we need to think about, I need to think about this fundamental challenge that I've posed, which is how does Africa anticipate where the world is going in order to inform the choices that it needs to make now. And really what I want to do is sketch out in very, very, very crude summary form the synthesis of these bodies of literature that help, I would suggest, a way of thinking about transition. So for Fisher-Kowalski, who really wants to understand initially the transition from hunter-gatherers to an agricultural society, the agricultural revolution, in terms of a shift in the metabolic flows to now the deployment of soils, of land, building materials, water, and biomass. And the next metabolic revolution being the transition to an industrial society where we mobilize fossil fuels, minerals, and metals. We deploy 8.7 billion hectares of land. We extract 120 billion tons of stuff per annum. We actually only use half of that. The rest is the throwaway and the environmental impact plus pollution. And the purpose of this literature is to basically say, well, can we conceptualize the transition to a more sustainable epoch in terms of a shift in those metabolic flows? Less fossil fuels, less pollution, less materials per capita, plus a shift to renewable energy. Now, Perez is not interested in metabolic flows, is not interested in the transitions from or to the industrial era. She's interested in the industrial revolution itself. And the S-curves that inform this entire literature on the sociology of technological revolutions, crisis points. So each of them 40 to 60 years on average, going through the traditional S-curve, starting off with innovations around which finance capital tends to cluster and overinvest. And because of the overinvestment driven by the herd mentality and over-optimism, a crisis, a bubble bursts. State moves in to reorganize society around the new innovations, and you have post-crisis a golden age, what Perez calls a golden age, a period when the innovations have become mainstreamed, productive capital gets behind them, finance capital gets slapped on the wrist, and goes and looks for the next generation of innovations, and so the S-curve continues. So this is the pattern of thinking which is very influential across quite a broad range of transition studies. Now, in her most recent work, Perez has started to address the sustainability literature, more, I would say, the green economy type literature. And her argument remains, she remains optimistic in the possibility that the post-crisis period of deployment of information technologies is going to deliver another golden age. The only problem is now echoing people like Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia, we have a planet to worry about which is falling to pieces because it's finite, and we are assuming that infinite growth is possible in a finite planet, so we just have to fix it. So like Jeff Sachs and others, the argument is we can still be optimistic about growth and development, ending poverty, using fairly standard ways of managing the economy. We just have to patch up the planet along the way. And that's really how I would summarize her current position. So the question is, can we synthesize a metabolic perspective which looks beyond the industrial eras, what led to the industrial era, what would lie beyond it, with this conception of industrial transitions? And my argument has been, and Perez and I disagree on this. We've tried to talk about it. We've both published in the journal Environmental Innovations and Societal Transitions, where she explicitly disagrees with my argument that maybe what we are looking at is a sixth cycle, a sixth industrial cycle, which is really going to be about a little bit of greenwashing or greening of the deployment period of the information age. But as finance capital gets disciplined, or maybe if, or possibly when, there's a big debate about that, austerity versus Keynesianism, whether if finance capital does get disciplined and does start to increase its investments in the green tech companies that are emerging, that would stimulate the kinds of much more radical and fundamental socio-technical innovations that would be necessary for a significant break in the metabolic structure of industrial society, possibly with a midterm crisis. So to map this out in a complex kind of way, these are Fisher-Kowalski's, if you like, metabolic cycles. The crisis we know about after 1929, leading to the post-Second World War long-term development cycle, which Charles Gore writes about, which hits its midterm crisis in the early 1970s, which is a key part of stimulating the emergence of the information technology revolution, the fifth techno-industrial surge, as Perez calls it, which in turn hits its midpoint crisis in 2001, gets saved by the China syndrome, and really hits hard in 2007 with the crash of Lehman Brothers in 2008, and 2009 being the first year since the Second World War that the global economy actually shrank. And that, for Charles Gore, is the key turning point. Charles Gore is saying, well, we are not really talking purely about a socio-technical revolution a la Perez. We're also talking about longer-term development cycles. And his argument, using a conjunctive type way of thinking, is that this might be the midpoint of this crisis, but it's the end of the long-term development cycle after the Second World War and the beginning of something else. If you then layer that into the metabolic perspective, is this a key turning point of significance? And do we need a conception of a sixth in techno-industrial surge organized around green tech to really be the operating system of the next greener, if you're an optimist, sustainable, longer-term development cycle, which is a fundamental metabolic rift with the industrial era? I layer into that complex story a suggestion that the fact that we are a majority urban society now, 7 billion people, 50% in cities, the next 2 billion who are going to land up on the planet are going to land up in Asian and African cities, we should probably be talking about not just the Anthropocene, but the urban Anthropocene. And that really links to my interest in cities as the spaces where a lot of these reconfigurations of infrastructures to conduct flows through everyday life is going to be faced. Cities become key in that discussion. In other words, put it differently, how cities at that spatial scale where you have an agglomeration of actors reconfigure everyday life is going to be the most significant driver of the wider and bigger transition. So this is the report that Paul was referring to, which is taking this idea of decoupling and applying it to cities. It's a report for the International Resource Panel, and as you can see, it's about urban resource flows and the governance of infrastructure transitions. Because I've become a little bit concerned about the community of researchers who study material flows and metabolic flows, because those flows are understood in quite disembodied ways. It's a bit like ecological footprinting. Once you know the metabolic flow through a national economy or a city, then what? What do you do then? You don't kind of manage flows. When it comes to cities, it's the urban infrastructures that conduct these flows through cities that really matter. But the problem is engineers have siloed the reality of infrastructure into different components, and there actually isn't a tradition of integrated management of urban infrastructures. And there's a discussion starting to emerge at MIT and Harvard on what that might entail, and that's work that I'm currently trying to address. So, if you're still with me, that reading, if you like, of the dynamics of global transition is what I bring back into the discussion about Africa's choices. And just to use this rather simple and kind of overused diagram, which is really the ecological footprint up against the ecological footprint up against the Human Development Index, with the world's countries clustered along this matrix. And so here you have your North American countries, your European countries in blue here, and some Asian countries. Your Latin American countries in red, clustered around here. Obviously, Asia's unsurprisingly spread out right across the spectrum, but the yellow are the African countries. And why this diagram is used so often in the conversation is, well, do you want to take African countries up the Human Development Index by moving them up the ecological footprint? Even if you do in a resource and carbon constrained world, can you? And what are the costs of that? So that really just, in a sense, helps to focus the question around the nature of our underlying assumptions about development. Now, this little diagram that you're looking at here comes out of a report by the McKinsey Global Institute, which I think was called Lions on the Move. We had tigers, now we've got lions on the African continent. And it's really the report that epitomizes the optimistic view of Africa's future. It, for example, focuses heavily on the fact that Africa's GDP, and remember my qualification, what Africa is, Africa's GDP by 2008 was equal to Brazil's and Russia's. Higher growth rates, which was only slightly dented during the recession. Most of Europe would love to have the growth rates of many African countries. Urbanization is taking place at a pace, generating higher average educational levels and a new middle class, and it's youthful. And most interestingly of all, these economies are diversifying. So resources as a percentage of continental GDP is down now to about 24%. However, this optimistic view doesn't like to engage with the dark side of the story. And some of the indicators of that would be, well, 80% of all Africa's exports are primary resources. Failed states, conceding all the limitations of that Western biased view of the world, 20 of the 30 top failed states are on the African continent. The most significant resource wars are on the African continent. And so we need to, if you like, I would suggest, have a balanced view and start to address the question of the sustainability of the optimism, the sustainability of the current growth rates, given the fact that they are a function of deepening resource extraction and exploitation on the one hand, and the rise of the BRICS countries and the decline of the traditional powers relative to the other powers, not absolute. So what I think might be useful to do is to look at Africa from a resource point of view. And this is research which actually originates in the resource panel, but was published by UNCTAD of all UN institutions, in its 2012 report on the African economy. As you probably know, UNCTAD brings out an annual report on Africa's economies. The 2012 report was devoted to the question of what it called the sustainable structural transformation of Africa's economies, and the root and the foundation of the analysis that was used to question African economic policies was this data. And this is what it shows. It shows that domestic material extraction over this period, 1980 to 2008, has increased by 87%. But as you can see, biomass is the most significant in terms of natural extraction of natural resources. But if you look at what Africa exports, it's not the biomass, it's the fossil fuels. So Africa is primarily a continent of exported fossil fuels. That's not how we traditionally see Africa, but that's the reality. And as you can see, over this period, the amount of fossil fuels that is being exported has gone from about 300 to nearly 600, nearly doubled in this period of time. And since about 2010, there's been discovery of new oil wells in all sorts of surprising places: Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, on the border between Namibia and South Africa, 12 million barrels in the sea, etc., etc. So there's an oil boom on the African continent, which these numbers don't reflect. If you look at what Africa imports, it's primarily biomass, but processed biomass, and primarily processed wheat-based products that are imported, most of which is going into North African countries. The fossil fuels, which is quite significant that you see here, this is refined fuels, obviously not crude. This is basically this is exporting your oil, your crude oil, and this is importing it back into the country after it's gone through a refinery in China or South Africa. So in short, Africa is a net exporter of non-renewable resources and a net importer of biomass. That's the first conclusion from these numbers. The second is, as far as non-renewables are concerned, exports 500 million tons and imports 100 million, mainly refined fuels, as I said. And as far as biomass is concerned, it exports 14.5 million tons and imports 95. And as I've already indicated, mainly cereals, and then mainly vegetable fats and oils, timber and sugar crops, etc. Now, the reports that I've already alluded to that have started to raise some red flags about this and the long-term consequences of those of these trends reflected in those numbers this is the 2012 UNCTAD report, and Charles Gore was the primary author of this report before he retired. So I think it was like he was saying, okay, I'm going to say the one thing I've always wanted to say about Africa, and I'm going to do it now because next year I retire. Okay? This report from the African Development Bank, Facilitating Green Growth, also raised questions about the sustainability of economic growth based on deepening resource extraction. So these are two significant if you like, discourses on the African continent, which help people like me to raise the difficult questions, to say, okay, let's not just wait and see and then place our bets. Let's anticipate what may be happening globally in order to start figuring out where we should be positioned to take advantage of the next long-term development cycle rather than missing it again. So it's in that light that I think we need to start understanding initiatives like this. Summit for Sustainability in Africa, organized by the Conservation International and a whole bunch of African presidents. And this conference, the delegates there signed a commitment to start doing natural capital accounting as part of a redefinition, as you can see there in the first part, recognizing the limitations of GDP as a measure of well-being. These kinds of discussions are starting to happen not just amongst intellectuals, but amongst policymakers as well. So it's in this light that we need to start thinking about what are the wider trends that may shape, may reinforce or undermine these dynamics. The one is climate change, and as you probably all know, the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report says the African continent is going to get hit hardest, although it's contributed at least to global warming, with all sorts of figures about agriculture and all sorts of other things. The thing that interests me most is soils, agricultural soils. A lot of the research coming out of IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, is suggesting 65% of Africa's arable soils are in trouble, are degraded. At the same time, it's a continent with the largest number of land grabs driven by the rise in food prices. The urbanization trends, we're currently at around 380, 390 million living in cities. It's projected to increase by another 850 million by 2050. At the same time, there's this new scramble for Africa. The new scramble for African resource wars, underpinning the rise of new scramble for African resources, underpinning the rise in resource wars in failed states. So I would argue that if you wanted to focus on a particular issue, it would be resource rents. And that's important because 80% of exports coming out of Africa are primary resources. So a lot is going to depend on what happens to the resource rents generated by this funding flow. And there is an increasingly interesting discussion on the African continent about this via the discourse of resource nationalism. Now, the Economist, unsurprisingly, picks up on this discourse and is very alarmed by it, saying, yet again, the Africans want to steal the wealth of the world. But there is a positive spin to it, which is, well, maybe Africans should get a better share, not necessarily the elites, but the majority. And if you could find institutional and governance mechanisms, which is the discussion on its own, to capture a greater share of those resource rents, you would want to invest in human capital, in infrastructure, particularly urban infrastructure, sustainability-oriented technological innovations, and the restoration of renewable resources, in particular soils. So how do you do that? One way is to follow the UNCTAD approach, and they've suggested in their 2012 report that in order to complement GDP as a measure, we should be measuring all sorts of other things. One option is material productivity or resource productivity, which is what Paul and I are supposed to worry about in the International Resource Panel. Ecological footprinting versus biological capacity, hectares. Human appropriation of net primary production, given the international standard of not more than 40%, is sustainable. Adjusted net savings, which is very, very interesting work that a little team, some legacy of Herman Daly somewhere in the World Bank, worried about natural capital. And they have produced 2 reports, Where is the Wealth of Nations? And developed this concept of adjusted net savings, which essentially adds investments into education and deducts the costs of pollution, drawdown of natural capital, etc. So it's a very interesting measure and a very interesting way of looking at the African continent, and obviously carbon intensity. So a combination of these tools can be deployed to assess the sustainability of African economies. This is what the UNCTAD assessment generates, saying if you took a strict assessment, in other words, negative on ecological footprint, HANIP, and adjusted net savings, these are the countries that are in trouble. If you take a very non-strict assessment, just negative on one of those, a whole bunch of countries look slightly better. And in their view, the most sustainable growth paths are being, they're not saying, this is not what sustainability means. This is more sustainable growth paths in these countries over here. So this is the kind of differentiation of different types of African countries that takes into account context and policy and their relationships to the new global powers that I think we need. I'm not saying this is the definitive work on the subject, but it's a useful way of helping to answer the question, will Africa miss the next long wave in the context of the wider conception of transition and the different drivers of that I summarized in the first part of this lecture. So to answer this question, I want to pick up on a couple of trends. The first is, yes, the relative decline of the traditional powers on the continent is good news. The bad news is that the BRICS countries, including South Africa, are primarily interested in Africa for resource reasons. And so I see a deepening of the dependence on resource extraction rather than a reduction in dependence on resource extraction. And that is a worry for me. However, the discourse on resource nationalism, as I've already indicated, interestingly, even suggestions, or maybe it's gone beyond that now, in Nigeria of a resource nationalism act to set up institutions for governing resource rents, the rise of sovereign wealth funds, like in Angola, who are being advised by the Norwegians, and various other opening up auctions, putting licensing concessions out to public auction, the Kimberley process on blood diamonds. There's a whole bunch of initiatives around trying to give some substance to this idea of resource nationalism, and I don't agree with the economist who simply just brushes it off as yet another trick by Africans, which it may be for certain people, but not in general, to just steal more. Justification, the kind of more kleptomaniacal desires and manipulations. I think it's not as simple as that. The second big challenge on the continent is going to be cities, in the context of that 800, 900 million going to be landing up in cities, which is part of the 2 billion new warm bodies that we're going to get on the planet, all of whom are going to land up in Asian and African cities. We have to face the fact that the next 2 billion are going to land up in spaces on the global economy least equipped to handle this. But the problem on the African continent, unlike many parts of Asia, is that the city is still a subject of denial. There isn't a single African country with an urban development policy. South Africa only now, 20 years later, is formulating an urban development policy. And at the center of an urban development policy must be the question of urban infrastructure. And that question must be raised in a highly problematized way. In other words, we have to make sure that African cities do not simply hand over the task of designing these urban infrastructures to the big five engineering firms around the world who are just going to cut and paste the designs from other contexts and drop them into African cities with a Chinese contract. And if you go through Nairobi now, you'll see highways. At least they've got bicycle lanes, but highways with African Development Bank funding and Chinese funding to build highways. Well, maybe you do need some highways, but at least you should complement that with investment in 21st century mobility, which is not just cars. The same applies to sewer, to energy infrastructures, to densities, to buildings, to every aspect of what it means to design and build a city. We on the African continent have an opportunity to really reimagine what this actually means in a more inclusive way. The third challenge is going to be soils. Now, what's quite just to highlight the problem on the continent. This is probably the most difficult one to really deal with, because if you read the African Development Bank report on greening the African economies, they say all the right things. You can't continue to depend on resource extraction. You're going to have to get into beneficiation. You're going to have to build infrastructure, etc. And then, and by the way, we've enlarged the fund to buy fertilizers. Now, I mean, that just, for me, captures the problem. Because what you need on the African continent, probably more so than anywhere else, is what Miguel Altieri, and in the Latin American context, called agroecological farming methods, where we don't default to just fertilizers and GMOs. We actually rebuild the biological capacity of the soils. And there are many examples around the African continent where this has been very, very successful, but it doesn't hit the headlines. It doesn't get into the glitzy conference rooms of the conferences funded by Rockefeller and Foundation and the Gates Foundation and the Ford Foundation about Africa's agricultural crisis. Those are not the stories that are told, and it's unfortunate. So I think the soils agenda needs to, which by the way, the soils as an issue in sustainability is the Cinderella in the sustainability world. We've surveyed every other resource in the world. The last global survey of soils was in 1990. So we really need to catch up globally when it comes to soils. But on the African continent, it's an absolute critical necessity. The fourth issue is energy. As I've already mentioned, there's the oil boom, there's a gas boom, there's increasing amounts of coal, like Mozambique. Whole chunks of Mozambique are just getting dug out and put on trains. The issue when it comes to energy resources in particular is that you're not going to stop this. And Ecuador is not going to be possible in the African continent, in my view. Pay us to keep the stuff in the ground. But what I think needs to be raised is the short-termist perspective. So basically, the ethic of African governments and the contractors that get the concessions to dig the stuff out of the ground is get it out of the ground as quickly as possible. I think we need a long-termist perspective which basically says, let's phase this over 100 years. Let's do net present value calculations on what the real value of this resource is, and let's not let it get driven by electoral terms or the insecurities of companies who are so excited about actually getting a license that they know it's not going to last very long because things are so unstable. So let's get the stuff out of the ground as quickly as possible. So the combination of electoral cycles and the, if you like, instabilities of Africa reinforces short-termism. And we need to deal with that. And then two final points. One is weak educational infrastructures. Obviously, none of the good ideas from UNCTAD or the African Development Bank or countries like Ethiopia or Rwanda or South Africa who are adopting green economy type policies, none of that's really going to happen without innovation. Sustainability-oriented innovation, systems, dynamics, cultures, networks, is a desperate need across the continent. But that is actually hamstrung by the weak educational infrastructures on the continent. So I'm part of a group working with the African Union on the idea of a Pan-African university, which is really a network, a kind of virtual assemblage of universities on the continent to build a new generation of PhD and postdocs who will stay on the continent, get educated on the continent. And then finally is obviously the vexed question of the state. Yes, I mean, the vexed question of the African state. Yes, thankfully, the impossibility thesis is on the decline. Yes, at the same time is the rise of the optimistic discourse about the developmental state. And all of this in the context of the reconfiguration of global powers and the rise of the BRICS on the continent. And yes, expanding middle class and new elites who are rooted in African economies and spend most of the time there. So my question when thinking about this is to say, well, our conception of the developmental state on the African continent tends to be overly influenced by the concept of the developmental state that emerged in the Asian tigers, the Asian economies, the new industrializing Asian economies in the last decades of the 20th century. And those developmental states define their role primarily as laying down the heavy infrastructures for modernization, for the transition from agricultural to industrial economies. Now, it's unsurprising that that's an appealing image on the continent. But in a world fundamentally now driven by knowledge, in the context of the midpoint crisis of the information age and the transition as productive capital through the global technology companies move into the space, should the African developmental state model itself on that 20th century conception of what it means to lay down the infrastructures for economic growth? Or should those developmental states say, well, we should be primarily in the business of knowledge and innovation? And that is a very different conception of the developmental state to the one that I think is dominant. It's a kind of knowledge-centered conception, which some might argue is completely idealistic in a continent of weak knowledge infrastructures. But it depends on how you define knowledge. And if you can handle the bridging of the informal and the formal, which is necessary on the African context, actually you can tap into extraordinary knowledge networks and resources. So to conclude, coming back to my primary question at the beginning, should Africa wait and see how the bones fall and then place its bets, or should it anticipate? And my argument would be it needs to anticipate, but it also needs to engage in shaping that global transition. And I think some of the configurations of governance, of infrastructures, of agroecological innovations, of the ability for flexibility, to learn and unlearn in a blink of an eye, which is so characteristic of what it means to be African. I think there may be something there that we can contribute to this global discussion. But above all, I think we need to make sure that African resources don't become the rocket fuel of an unjust transition. But Africans need to utilize that resource jealously, strategically, informed by a sense of what could unfold if it managed those resources differently. Thanks very much.